The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the country club. The sound cut through the elegant chatter like a knife, and for a moment, every perfectly manicured head turned toward me. My father's voice had just delivered the final blow, loud enough for the entire anniversary party to hear. "You'll never be as successful as your brother, Emma. Some people are born winners, and others," he gestured dismissively in my direction, his Rolex catching the chandelier light, "others just dream about it." The silence that followed felt like drowning. My mother, Patricia, smoothed her silk dress and whispered something urgent to the waiter about cleaning up my mess. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." My brother Michael stood frozen beside our father, his medical degree practically gleaming on his chest like armor. He'd just announced his promotion to chief of cardiology at 32, and the room had erupted in applause. Now they were all staring at me, the family disappointment in my wrinkled jeans and discount store blouse, wondering what I could possibly say to defend myself. I didn't say anything. I just walked out into the October rain, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floors, past the oil paintings of long-dead club members, past the mahogany and crystal that represented everything I'd never be worthy of in my father's eyes. Behind me, I heard him apologizing to his guests, explaining that I'd been going through a rough patch and that they shouldn't mind me, as if I were some embarrassing family secret that needed to be swept under the Persian rug. The rain soaked through my thin jacket as I sat on the stone steps of the country club, watching BMWs and Mercedes pull away into the night. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate asking how the dinner went. I stared at the screen, unable to type the words that would make any of this make sense. How do you explain that your own father just humiliated you in front of 50 people? How do you describe the look in his eyes, like I was some failed experiment he'd given up on years ago? My name is Emma Collins, and that night changed everything. I was 28 years old, working 3 part-time jobs just to afford half of a studio apartment in the worst part of downtown Portland. By day I stocked shelves at a grocery store. Evenings I tutored kids in math for $12 an hour. Weekends I cleaned offices, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans while wearing rubber gloves that left my hands raw and cracked. None of it was glamorous, but it kept me fed and housed, which was more than I'd had 2 years earlier when I'd dropped out of law school. The law school thing was my father's idea, of course. Richard Collins, senior partner at Collins, Hartwell and Associates, had my entire life mapped out from the moment I could walk. I'd graduate summa cum laude, like Michael, pass the bar exam on the first try, and join the family firm as the junior associate who fetched coffee and filed paperwork for the first 5 years. Then if I proved myself worthy, I might eventually handle the smaller cases, the ones that didn't matter enough for the real lawyers to bother with. But law school felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Every morning I'd sit in constitutional law or torts, surrounded by students who spoke the language of justice and precedent like they'd been born to it, while I felt like an imposter counting down the minutes until I could escape. The pressure was suffocating. My father called every Sunday to check my grades, quiz me on my readings, remind me that the Collins name meant something in this city and I had better not embarrass it. When I finally worked up the courage to tell him I wanted to drop out, he didn't speak to me for 3 months. My mother would call occasionally, her voice careful and measured, asking if I'd come to my senses yet, and when I planned to re-enroll. Michael tried to play peacekeeper, suggesting that maybe I just needed a break, that the stress was getting to me. He meant well, but he couldn't understand what it felt like to disappoint someone who'd never really believed in you to begin with. The thing is, I'd always been different from the rest of my family. While Michael was dissecting frogs and memorizing the periodic table, I was in my bedroom teaching myself to code. I'd discovered programming when I was 14, staying up until 3 in the morning working through online tutorials, building little websites and games that nobody else would ever see. It felt like magic, the way you could create something from nothing, solve problems with logic and creativity, build entire worlds inside a computer screen. But that wasn't serious work, according to my father. Programming was a hobby, something you did for fun, not something you built a career on. Real professionals wore suits and worked in offices with mahogany desks and leather chairs. They had secretaries and business cards with embossed lettering. They belonged to country clubs and played golf on Wednesday afternoons. After I dropped out of law school, I tried to explain my passion for technology, showed him a mobile app I'd built that helped people track their daily water intake. He barely glanced at it before saying, "That's nice, honey, but when are you going to get a real job?" The dismissal in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. He didn't even consider what I'd created worth arguing about, so I got real jobs. 3 of them, actually. I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out my next move. But months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2, and somehow I'd become exactly what my father always said I'd be: a disappointment. I lived in a neighborhood where gunshots weren't uncommon, where my neighbors included a struggling single mother with 2 kids, an elderly man who collected cans for extra income, and a woman who worked nights at a diner and slept during the day. My apartment was a converted studio above a laundromat, 400 square feet of cramped space that smelled perpetually of detergent and fabric softener. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation, every argument, every late-night phone call from the units around me. My bed was a futon that doubled as a couch, and my kitchen was a hot plate and a mini fridge that made more noise than it was worth. But it was mine, and I'd earned every square inch of it through early mornings and aching feet and the kind of honest work that left you too tired to dream. The grocery store where I worked was called Save Mart, and it was exactly as depressing as it sounds. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow. The floors were perpetually sticky, despite being mopped twice daily, and the customers treated you like you were invisible, or worse, like you were some sort of inconvenience they had to navigate around to get to the products they actually wanted. My manager Gary was a 40-something man with a beer gut and a tendency to stand too close when he talked to the female employees. He seemed to take special pleasure in assigning me the worst tasks: cleaning up spills in aisle 7, dealing with expired products in the dairy section, facing the shelves at closing time when my back was already screaming from 8 hours on my feet. When I asked about advancement opportunities, he laughed and said, "This isn't exactly a career track, sweetheart." The tutoring was better, at least emotionally. I worked with kids whose parents couldn't afford the fancy learning centers that charged $100 an hour. These were children whose families scraped together my modest fee because education mattered to them, even when money was tight. I'd meet them at the public library, or in their cramped apartments, helping them with algebra and geometry, watching their faces light up when a concept finally clicked. There was Maria, whose mother worked 2 jobs and spoke limited English but insisted her daughter would be the first in their family to go to college. There was Jamie, a kid with ADHD who'd been written off by his teachers, but had an incredible mind for mathematical patterns once you found the right way to reach him. There was Sarah, whose parents were going through a messy divorce, and whose grades had tanked because she couldn't concentrate on anything except the fighting that echoed through her house every night. These kids reminded me why I'd loved learning in the first place, before it became about grades and expectations and family legacy. They approached problems with curiosity instead of fear, asked questions because they genuinely wanted to understand, not because they were trying to impress anyone. Sometimes, after a particularly good session where everything had clicked, and a student had gone from confusion to confidence, I'd remember what it felt like to be passionate about something. But those moments were rare, and they didn't pay the bills. Most of my energy went into the office cleaning job, which was by far the most soul-crushing of my 3 sources of income. I worked for a company called Sparkle Clean Services, which sounds much more glamorous than emptying trash cans and scrubbing toilets at corporate offices downtown. The work started at 7 p.m. and went until midnight, after all the important people had gone home to their families and suburban houses. I'd put on my uniform, a polyester shirt with the company logo that never quite came clean, no matter how many times I washed it, and drive to buildings filled with empty cubicles and conference rooms that still smelled like coffee and ambition. I'd clean the bathrooms where executives had made important phone calls, vacuum the carpets where million-dollar deals had been discussed, wipe down the windows that looked out over a city full of opportunities I couldn't seem to reach. The worst part wasn't the physical labor, though my knees ached constantly and my hands were perpetually dry from the cleaning chemicals. The worst part was the invisibility. Sometimes when I was working late and the security guards were doing their rounds, they'd walk right past me like I wasn't even there. To them I was part of the building's infrastructure, as anonymous and forgettable as the elevator or the coffee machine. During those long nights, as I cleaned offices that were nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived, I'd think about the people who worked there during the day. Their framed diplomas on the walls, their family photos on their desks, their expensive suits hanging on the backs of chairs. I'd wonder what it would feel like to be important enough to have your own office, to make decisions that mattered, to be respected for your mind instead of judged for your circumstances. Sometimes I'd sit in one of those executive chairs during my break, just for a moment, imagining what it would be like to belong in a place like that. But then I'd remember where I was supposed to be, and get back to work, back to being invisible, back to being the kind of person who cleaned up after other people's success, instead of creating my own. The only escape I had was coding. After my shifts, when I was too wired to sleep despite being exhausted, I'd open my laptop on the card table that served as my desk, and lose myself in lines of code. I was teaching myself new programming languages, working through online courses, building projects that nobody would ever see but that made me feel like I was still capable of creating something meaningful. I'd started working on something bigger, an idea that had been growing in the back of my mind for months. I'd noticed during my tutoring sessions that a lot of parents struggled to find affordable educational resources for their kids. The expensive tutoring centers were out of reach for most families, but the free online resources were scattered and inconsistent. What if there was a platform that connected students with qualified tutors at reasonable rates, with built-in tools for scheduling, progress tracking, and payment processing? I called it LearnLink, and I'd been building it piece by piece during my sleepless nights. The interface was clean and intuitive, designed to work on both computers and phones, so that families could access it regardless of their technology situation. I'd created profiles for both tutors and students, matching algorithms based on subject needs and learning styles, even a built-in video chat system for remote sessions. But who was I kidding? I was a grocery store clerk who cleaned toilets for extra money. What did I know about building a real business? Every time I made progress on the platform, doubt would creep in. My father's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that I wasn't cut out for anything important, that I should focus on finding a stable job with benefits instead of chasing impossible dreams. The night of my parents' anniversary dinner, I'd actually been planning to show Michael my project. He'd always been supportive, even when he didn't fully understand what I was trying to do. I thought maybe if he saw what I'd built, he could help me figure out the next steps. Maybe he'd even invest a small amount to help me get started. But then my father had made his announcement about never being successful, and the moment had passed. Sitting on those country club steps in the rain, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and opened the App Store, searching for business registration services. If my father thought I'd never amount to anything, I'd prove him wrong. I'd show him what real success looked like, built from the ground up with nothing but determination, and late nights, and the kind of hunger that only comes from being underestimated your entire life. I incorporated LearnLink Educational Services LLC right there on those stone steps, using my phone and a credit card that was dangerously close to its limit. The filing fee was $150, money I didn't really have but couldn't afford not to spend. As I typed in the business address, my tiny apartment above the laundromat, I thought about all the times my father had told me I lacked ambition, that I didn't have what it took to be a real entrepreneur. The confirmation email arrived at 11:47 p.m. Emma Collins, CEO and founder of LearnLink Educational Services LLC. It looked ridiculous on my phone screen, those official titles attached to someone who'd spend tomorrow morning stocking cereal boxes, and tomorrow evening scrubbing office bathrooms. But it was real, and it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I might actually be capable of something greater than my circumstances. The next few weeks were a blur of 18-hour days, and caffeine-fueled coding sessions. I kept my 3 jobs because I needed the income, but every spare moment went into refining the platform. I reached out to my former tutoring students and their parents, explaining my vision and asking if they'd be willing to test the early version. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents loved the idea of having verified affordable tutors at their fingertips. Students appreciated the interactive tools and progress tracking features. Word spread through the networks of families I'd worked with. Maria's mother mentioned it to other parents at her daughter's school. Jamie's mom posted about it in a local Facebook group for parents of children with learning differences. Sarah's dad, who worked in marketing, helped me create some basic promotional materials in exchange for free tutoring sessions for his daughter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Within a month, I had 50 registered tutors and over 200 student profiles. The platform was processing its first payments, taking a small percentage of each session while keeping rates affordable for families and fair for tutors. I'd created something that actually helped people, that solved a real problem in the world, and I'd done it while my father was probably telling his golf buddies about his daughter who couldn't even finish law school. But success wasn't linear, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were technical issues that kept me up all night troubleshooting. There were weeks when I barely made enough to cover my platform hosting costs and still pay rent. There were moments when I questioned whether I was just delaying the inevitable reality that my father was right, that I'd never amount to anything significant. The tutoring business was seasonal, busier during the school year and practically non-existent during summer break. I had to get creative about marketing, reaching out to homeschooling groups, summer camps, and families preparing for standardized tests. I learned about search engine optimization, social media advertising, and the dozens of small details that separate a functioning business from a successful one. My living situation became even more precarious as I invested every available dollar back into the business. I gave up my cell phone plan and relied on free Wi-Fi wherever I could find it. I bought generic groceries and cooked simple meals on my hot plate. I patched the holes in my shoes with duct tape and wore the same 3 outfits on rotation, washing them by hand in my bathroom sink to save money on laundromat fees. Gary at Save Mart started giving me fewer hours, claiming that my performance had declined. He wasn't wrong. I was exhausted running on 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee, making mistakes that I never would have made when the job was my primary focus. When he called me into his office to discuss my attitude, I realized that I was holding on to these jobs out of fear rather than necessity. The fear was real though. What if LearnLink failed? What if I couldn't scale it beyond the local community? What if my father had been right all along and I was just setting myself up for an even more spectacular failure? At least with my 3 jobs, I had a guaranteed income, however modest. Entrepreneurship felt like jumping off a cliff and hoping I'd figure out how to fly before hitting the ground. But staying safe also meant staying small. It meant continuing to clean other people's offices while my own business operated out of a 400-square-foot apartment. It meant showing up to family gatherings with nothing to show for myself except tired eyes and calloused hands. It meant accepting my father's assessment of my potential and proving him right through inaction rather than inadequacy. The turning point came when I received an email from the Portland Public School District. Someone had recommended LearnLink as a resource for families who couldn't afford traditional tutoring services. They wanted to discuss a potential partnership that would connect low-income students with qualified tutors, with the district providing partial funding for sessions. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, reading it over and over again. This was the kind of opportunity that could transform LearnLink from a small local platform into something that actually made a difference in the education system. But it also meant committing fully to the business, hiring additional contractors, developing new features, and essentially betting everything on my ability to succeed. I called in sick to Save Mart the next day and drove to the school district offices in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, wearing the only professional outfit I owned, a black dress I'd bought for law school interviews and hadn't worn since. The meeting was with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the district's director of student support services, a woman who radiated the kind of confidence I'd always envied in other people. She explained that the district had been struggling to address the achievement gap between students who could afford private tutoring and those who couldn't. They'd tried various programs, but nothing had been as flexible or cost-effective as what LearnLink offered. The potential contract would provide tutoring services for up to 500 students over the course of the school year, with the district covering 60% of the costs and families paying the remainder on a sliding scale based on income. The numbers were staggering. If I could fulfill this contract successfully, LearnLink would generate more revenue in one school year than I'd made in the previous 2 years combined from all 3 of my jobs. But it also meant expanding rapidly, ensuring quality control across a much larger network of tutors, and managing the kind of administrative complexity that kept me awake at night just thinking about it. Dr. Martinez gave me 2 weeks to submit a formal proposal, complete with detailed implementation plans, quality assurance measures, and proof of insurance and bonding. I left that meeting feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. This was my chance to prove that LearnLink wasn't just a side project or a pipe dream. This was my opportunity to show my father, my family, and myself that I was capable of building something significant. I gave notice at all 3 of my jobs that week. Gary wasn't surprised, though he made a point of telling me that I'd never be eligible for rehire if my little computer thing didn't work out. My office cleaning supervisor just shrugged and said they'd find someone else to cover my routes. The tutoring families were more supportive, several of them offering to serve as references for my school district proposal. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't have to set 3 different alarms or worry about scheduling conflicts between jobs. Instead, I had 2 weeks to create the most important business proposal of my life, knowing that everything I'd worked for depended on convincing a school district that a grocery store clerk with a laptop and a dream could deliver educational services for 500 students. I spent the next 14 days living on coffee and determination, crafting a proposal that covered every possible concern the district might have. I researched educational best practices, created detailed workflows for tutor vetting and training, developed quality metrics and reporting systems. I reached out to current tutors on the platform and convinced 12 of them to commit to expanding their availability if we won the contract. The financial projections were the hardest part. I had to price the services competitively while ensuring I could pay tutors fairly and keep the business sustainable. I factored in the costs of customer service, technical support, platform improvements, and the administrative overhead that would come with managing such a large program. The margins were thin, but they worked. 3 days before the proposal was due, I realized I needed professional liability insurance and a business bank account, requirements I'd somehow overlooked in my initial excitement. I spent an entire day on the phone with insurance companies and banks, explaining my business model to representatives who clearly had never heard of anything like LearnLink before. The insurance was expensive, eating into my already limited savings. The bank required a minimum balance I barely had and monthly fees that made me wince. But these were the costs of legitimacy, the price of being taken seriously as a real business rather than a hobby project run out of someone's apartment. I submitted the proposal at 11:58 p.m. on the final day, hitting send and then immediately second-guessing every decision I'd made. The font looked unprofessional, the financial projections were too optimistic, the implementation timeline was too aggressive. I'd included too much technical detail that would confuse non-technical readers. I hadn't included enough technical detail to demonstrate competency, but it was done, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Dr. Martinez had said they'd notify all applicants within 3 weeks. 3 weeks of checking my email obsessively, refreshing my phone every few minutes, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life by quitting stable employment to chase an opportunity that might not even exist. During those weeks, I tried to keep busy with existing clients and platform improvements, but everything felt like it was in limbo. I'd committed to this path completely, burning bridges with my former employers and investing every available resource into the business. There was no safety net anymore, no backup plan if things didn't work out. My parents didn't know about any of this, of course. As far as they were concerned, I was still the family disappointment, still struggling to find my way in the world, still proving their assessment of my limited potential. Michael had called a few times, checking in and asking how I was doing, but I'd kept my answers vague. I wanted to have something concrete to show them, something that would make the years of doubt and dismissal worth it. On a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 19 days after I'd submitted the proposal, my phone rang with a call from the school district. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it before managing to answer. Dr. Martinez's voice was warm but professional as she delivered the news that would change everything. LearnLink had been selected as the district's tutoring partner for the upcoming spring semester. The contract was worth $230,000 over 6 months. More money than I'd made in the previous 5 years combined. More than my father made in a single quarter at his law firm. More than enough to prove that sometimes the family disappointment knows exactly what she's doing. But first I had to deliver on every promise I'd made in that proposal. I had less than 2 months to scale my operation from 50 tutors to over 150, implement new quality control systems, hire customer service staff, and prepare for the administrative complexity of serving 500 students simultaneously. The next 8 weeks were a masterclass in controlled chaos. I moved out of my studio apartment and into a small office space in a converted warehouse downtown. Nothing fancy, just an open room with concrete floors and industrial lighting, but it was mine and it was official and it had enough space for the team I was frantically trying to assemble. I hired my first full-time employee, a recent college graduate named Alex, who'd been tutoring on the platform and had shown remarkable skill at both teaching and customer service. Then came Rebecca, a former teacher who understood the educational side of the business better than I ever could. Then David, a programmer who could help me manage the technical infrastructure as we scaled up rapidly. Finding qualified tutors was like conducting a massive job interview process. I developed screening procedures, background check requirements, and training protocols that would ensure every tutor met the district's standards. Some of my existing tutors weren't comfortable with the increased structure and oversight, but most embraced the opportunity for more consistent work and better pay. The platform itself needed significant upgrades to handle the increased volume and meet the district's reporting requirements. I spent countless nights coding new features, testing systems, and fixing bugs that only appeared under heavy load. Every dollar the business made went back into infrastructure, personnel, and the hundreds of small expenses that accumulate when you're trying to build something bigger than yourself. 3 weeks before the program was scheduled to launch, I got a call from my mother. She'd heard through some social connection that I was involved in a business that was working with the school district. Her voice had a tone I hadn't heard before, curious rather than concerned, interested rather than dismissive. I told her about LearnLink, about the contract, about the team I was building, and the students we'd be serving. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely impressed by something I was doing. She asked questions about the business model, the technology, the growth potential. She even asked if I needed any help with legal documentation, mentioning that she could refer me to attorneys who specialized in education law. But I didn't want their help anymore. I'd spent too many years waiting for their approval, their support, their belief in my potential. I'd built LearnLink without them, and I was going to succeed without them. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. The program launched on January 15th, and the first week was simultaneously the most exciting and terrifying of my life. 500 students logging onto the platform, connecting with tutors, scheduling sessions, beginning the process that would hopefully help them succeed in ways that traditional classroom instruction couldn't achieve alone. There were technical glitches, of course. Server crashes during peak hours, payment processing errors, scheduling conflicts that required manual intervention. My team and I worked around the clock to resolve issues, often sleeping in the office and surviving on takeout food and energy drinks. But the students were learning, the tutors were teaching, and the platform was working exactly as I'd envisioned it. By the end of the first month, we'd facilitated over 3,000 tutoring sessions. Student performance data showed measurable improvements in grades and test scores. Parent feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The district administrators, who'd taken a chance on us, were seeing results that exceeded their expectations. And then on a cold February morning, I got the call that would make everything worth it. Dr. Martinez wanted to meet about extending the contract for the following school year and potentially expanding the program to serve additional districts throughout the state. LearnLink had become more than just a business. It had become a solution to a real problem, a bridge between students who needed help and qualified people who could provide it. That night, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since the anniversary dinner. I sat in their driveway for 10 minutes, looking at the house I'd grown up in, thinking about all the times I'd walked through that front door, feeling like a disappointment, like someone who didn't quite measure up to the family's expectations. But tonight was different. Tonight I had something to show them. I knocked on the front door instead of using my key, a small gesture that felt important somehow. When my mother opened it, her face went through a series of expressions that I'd never seen before. Surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pride, all flickering across her features in the span of seconds. "Emma," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" The living room looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago during that disastrous anniversary dinner. The same Persian rug, the same oil paintings, the same crystal figurines arranged on the mantel like tiny soldiers. But I felt different standing there, like I was seeing it all through new eyes. This wasn't the palace of success I'd once imagined it to be. It was just a house, filled with expensive things that didn't actually mean anything. "Where's Dad?" I asked, noticing his absence from his usual spot in the leather recliner. "He's in his study, preparing for tomorrow's depositions. Should I get him?" I nodded, suddenly nervous in a way I hadn't expected. I'd rehearsed this moment countless times during the drive over, but now that it was actually happening, my carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. My mother disappeared down the hallway, and I could hear muffled conversation, her voice explaining that I was here and wanted to talk to both of them. When they emerged together, my father looked exactly as I'd remembered him. Perfectly pressed shirt, gold-rimmed glasses, the kind of authoritative presence that had intimidated me my entire childhood. He settled into his chair with the air of someone granting an audience, while my mother perched on the edge of the sofa like she was preparing for bad news. "Well," he said, checking his watch. "What's this about, Emma? I have quite a bit of work to finish tonight." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared, setting it on the coffee table between us. Inside were printouts of revenue reports, client testimonials, news articles about the school district partnership, and a business plan projection that showed where LearnLink would be in 5 years if current growth trends continued. "I wanted to show you something," I said, opening the folder to reveal the first page. It was a screenshot of the platform dashboard, showing real-time statistics. Active tutors, 167. Registered students, 812. Sessions completed this week, 431. My father leaned forward slightly, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he began to examine the documents. My mother moved closer, reading over his shoulder. The silence stretched out as they absorbed what they were seeing, and I watched their faces carefully for any sign of recognition, of understanding what this all meant. "What exactly am I looking at?" my father asked finally, though his tone had shifted from dismissive to curious. "This is my business," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. LearnLink Educational Services. We connect students with qualified tutors through an online platform. Last month we facilitated over 2,000 tutoring sessions. This month we're on track to hit 3,000. I turned to the next page, which showed the financial summary. Revenue, expenses, profit margins, growth projections. Numbers that told a story of success that even my father couldn't argue with. His eyebrows rose slightly as he processed the figures, and I saw him double-check the calculations in his head the way he'd always done when reviewing contracts. "This says you made nearly $40,000 last month," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that accurate?" "Actually, we made $47,000 in February," I corrected. "And we're projecting $62,000 for March. The school district contract has been even more successful than we anticipated, and word is spreading to other districts throughout the state." My father set down the papers and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. There was something in his expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion and what might have been respect. He was trying to reconcile the daughter he'd written off as a failure with the business owner sitting in front of him presenting legitimate success. "How long has this been operating?" he asked. "I incorporated the business the night of your anniversary dinner," I said, letting that detail sink in. "The night you told everyone I'd never be as successful as Michael." I went home and filed the paperwork that same evening. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Heavier. My mother's hand went to her throat, touching the pearl necklace she always wore when she was nervous. My father's face was unreadable, the same expression he probably wore during difficult negotiations. "I don't understand," my mother said finally. "You were working at that grocery store. You were cleaning offices. When did you have time to build all of this?" "Nights, weekends, every spare moment I could find," I explained. I'd been developing the platform for months before I incorporated, teaching myself new programming languages, researching the education market, building the technology piece by piece. The jobs were just to pay the bills while I created something bigger. I turned to another page in the folder, this one showing testimonials from students and parents. Stories of improved grades, increased confidence, academic achievements that might not have been possible without the tutoring services. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people whose lives had been impacted by something I'd built. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a letter from a single mother whose son had raised his math grade from a D to a B+ after just 6 weeks of tutoring through the platform. Or this one, from a girl who was struggling with reading comprehension and is now performing at grade level for the first time in 3 years. My father picked up the testimonials and read through them carefully, his lawyer's attention to detail evident in the way he examined each signature, each letterhead. These were real documents from real people, not marketing materials or fabricated success stories. They represented tangible results that even his skeptical mind couldn't dismiss. The technology is impressive, he admitted grudgingly. But what's your competitive advantage? How do you know this isn't just a temporary success that other companies will copy and improve upon? It was exactly the kind of question I'd expected from him, the analytical challenge that had intimidated me for years. But this time, I had answers. Real answers, backed by research and experience, and the confidence that comes from actually building something valuable. First mover advantage in the affordable education space, I said, counting off on my fingers. We're not trying to compete with the high-end tutoring centers that charge hundreds of dollars per session. We're serving the market that's been underserved, families who need help but can't afford premium prices. Our technology makes it possible to connect qualified tutors with students at rates that work for everyone. I pulled out another document, this one showing our tutor retention rates and satisfaction scores. Second, we've created a platform that actually benefits the tutors as much as the students. Most education companies treat teachers like contractors to be squeezed for maximum profit. We provide better pay, flexible scheduling, and professional development opportunities. Happy tutors provide better service, which creates better outcomes for students. My mother was looking back and forth between my father and me like she was watching a tennis match, following an argument in a language she didn't quite speak. But my father was engaged now, leaning forward, asking the kinds of questions he'd ask a potential business partner, rather than a daughter he was humoring. What about scalability? He pressed. You're operating in one city, with one school district. How do you expand without losing quality control? We're already in talks with 3 other districts in Oregon, I said, turning to the expansion timeline I'd prepared. The platform is built to scale efficiently. Adding new markets doesn't require rebuilding the technology, just recruiting local tutors and establishing relationships with local schools. We're projecting operations in 5 cities by the end of this year. For the next hour, we went through every aspect of the business. Marketing strategies, customer acquisition costs, competitive analysis, financial projections. My father asked tough questions, and I had detailed answers for all of them. This wasn't a hobby project or a pipe dream anymore. This was a legitimate business with real revenue, real customers, and real growth potential. When we finally finished reviewing everything, my father sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. My mother looked like she was processing information that didn't quite fit with her understanding of the world. I'd gone from being the family disappointment to being someone they didn't recognize, and that transition was clearly difficult for both of them to navigate. I have to admit, my father said finally, this is not what I expected when you dropped out of law school. What did you expect? I asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for another moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. I expected you to struggle for a few years and then eventually come back, asking for help finding a stable job. I thought the programming thing was a phase, something you'd grow out of, once you realized how difficult it is to make a living without a traditional profession. You thought I'd fail, I said. It wasn't a question. I thought you were making a mistake, he corrected, but the distinction felt minimal. I've seen too many young people chase dreams that don't pay the bills. I wanted you to have security, stability, the kind of career that would provide for you regardless of economic conditions. Like law, I said. Like law, he agreed. Or medicine like Michael. Professions with clear advancement paths, established earning potential, social respect. I understood his perspective, even if I disagreed with it. He'd grown up in a different era, when career paths were more predictable and technology hadn't yet created opportunities that didn't exist when he was making his own professional choices. But understanding his reasoning didn't make his dismissal hurt any less. The thing is, I said, I never wanted those things. I never wanted to be a lawyer or join your firm or spend my life arguing cases I didn't care about. I wanted to build things, solve problems, create solutions that didn't exist before. And it turns out there's actually a pretty good living in that, if you're willing to work for it. My mother spoke up for the first time in 20 minutes. "We didn't know you were capable of this," she said, gesturing at the documents spread across the coffee table. "You never showed us what you were working on. We had no idea you developed these skills." "I tried to show you," I reminded her. "Remember the app I built for tracking water intake, or the website I designed for the neighbor's small business? You told me those were nice hobbies, but I should focus on my real future." She looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat. "We thought we were giving you good advice. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment. Instead, you were protecting yourselves from being wrong about me," I said more gently than I'd intended. It was easier to believe I didn't have potential than to admit you didn't recognize the potential I actually had. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with my parents. For the first time, we talked about expectations and disappointment and the ways families can sometimes limit each other without meaning to. My father admitted that he'd been concerned about my unconventional path, partly because he didn't understand it, and what you don't understand can feel threatening when it involves someone you care about. My mother talked about her own regrets, how she'd given up her teaching career when she married my father, and sometimes wondered what might have been different if she'd pursued her own ambitions more aggressively. She saw something in my story that resonated with choices she'd made decades earlier, roads not taken that might have led to different destinations. But the most surprising moment came when my father asked about my 5-year plan, and I realized he was asking not as a skeptical parent, but as someone who might be interested in providing business advice. He had connections in the education sector, experience with corporate partnerships, knowledge about legal structures that could benefit a growing company. "If you're serious about expanding statewide," he said, "you're going to need sophisticated legal agreements with each district. Contract law, liability issues, compliance with educational regulations. These aren't areas where you can afford to learn as you go." It was an offer of help, wrapped in practical business language, but an offer nonetheless. For years I'd wanted his support and guidance. Now that I had it, I discovered something unexpected: I didn't need it anymore. I'd already figured out how to navigate those challenges, either through my own research or by hiring qualified professionals who specialized in areas outside my expertise. "I appreciate that," I said. "I really do, but I've already retained an education law firm that specializes in technology companies. They're helping us structure the expansion properly from the beginning." Something flickered across his face, an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, mixed with something that might have been disappointment, that I no longer needed his rescue. He'd spent so many years positioning himself as the family expert, the one with all the answers, that my independence was both impressive and slightly threatening to his sense of his own importance. We talked for another hour, covering everything from my hiring plans, to my office lease, to the challenges of managing rapid growth while maintaining service quality. By the time I gathered up my documents and prepared to leave, the dynamic between us had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer the family disappointment seeking approval. I was a business owner sharing information with potential advisors, operating from a position of strength rather than need. As I was putting on my coat, my father said something that surprised me more than anything else that had happened that evening. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "What I said at the anniversary dinner was unfair and unkind. You've built something impressive here, Emma. Something I didn't think you were capable of, and that says more about my limitations than yours." It was the closest thing to an admission of error I'd ever heard from him, and it meant more than I'd expected it to. Not because I needed his validation anymore, but because it represented a recognition of who I actually was, rather than who he'd thought I should be. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." My mother walked me to the door, and as I was leaving, she said quietly, "Your brother doesn't know about any of this, does he?" "Not yet," I admitted. "I wanted to tell you first." She nodded, understanding the significance of that choice. "He's going to be so proud of you." We all are. Driving home through the quiet streets of my childhood neighborhood, I thought about how different this visit had been from what I'd imagined during all those months of building the business in secret. I'd expected more drama, more resistance, more of the dismissive attitude I'd grown up with. Instead, I'd found parents who were capable of growth, of admitting they'd been wrong, of seeing their daughter as someone other than the person they'd thought they knew. But the most important discovery was that their approval, while nice to have, wasn't actually necessary for my success or happiness. I'd built LearnLink without their support, and I could continue growing it regardless of what they thought about my choices. The validation I'd been seeking for so long had come from my students, my tutors, my customers, and most importantly, from myself. The next morning, I got a call from Michael. Word had traveled fast through the family network, and my mother had apparently shared the news of my business success with characteristic enthusiasm. His voice was excited, almost incredulous, as he asked me to explain what I'd been up to during the months when he'd thought I was still struggling to find my direction. "Emma, this is incredible," he said after I'd given him the abbreviated version of the LearnLink story. "I had no idea you were building something this significant. Why didn't you tell me what you were working on?" "Honestly, I wasn't sure it would work," I admitted, "and I didn't want to deal with more family skepticism if it failed. It was easier to build it quietly and then present the results once I had something concrete to show." "But I would have supported you," he protested. "I could have helped with the medical aspects of the tutoring, maybe connected you with families who needed academic support for kids with learning disabilities or health challenges." He was right, and I realized I'd made assumptions about his reaction based on our parents' attitudes rather than giving him a chance to respond on his own terms. Michael had always been encouraging, even when he didn't fully understand my interests. My decision to keep the business secret from everyone had been driven by fear and pride rather than strategic thinking. "You're right," I said. "I should have trusted you more. But it's not too late. If you're interested in collaborating on some aspects of the platform, I'd love to explore that." We ended up meeting for coffee that afternoon, and I showed him the same documents I'd presented to our parents the night before. But Michael's questions were different, focused on the educational outcomes rather than the business metrics. He wanted to know about student success rates, tutor training protocols, methods for identifying and addressing learning differences. "This could be really powerful for kids who struggle in traditional classroom settings," he said, scrolling through the testimonials on my laptop. "Have you considered partnerships with pediatric practices? Sometimes parents bring up academic concerns during medical visits, and we don't always have good resources to recommend." It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd hoped for from family involvement, collaboration that could benefit both the business and the communities we served. Within 2 hours, we'd outlined a pilot program that would connect pediatric healthcare providers with LearnLink's educational resources, creating a referral network that could identify and support struggling students more effectively. That conversation with Michael made me realize how much energy I'd wasted on family dynamics that were ultimately less important than I'd believed them to be. I'd spent years feeling diminished by my father's lack of confidence in my abilities, when I could have been focusing that emotional energy on building relationships with people who shared my values and supported my goals. The real validation had come from my customers, from the students whose grades improved and the parents who sent grateful messages about their children's increased confidence. It had come from the tutors who told me that working through LearnLink was the most fulfilling teaching experience they'd ever had. It had come from school district administrators, who were seeing measurable improvements in student outcomes. But perhaps most importantly, it had come from myself. From the knowledge that I'd identified a real problem, developed an effective solution, and built a sustainable business that made a positive difference in people's lives. That sense of accomplishment couldn't be diminished by family skepticism or enhanced by family approval. It existed independently, grounded in evidence and results, rather than opinions and expectations. 3 weeks after my parents' house visit, I received an email that would change everything yet again. The Oregon Department of Education wanted to discuss a statewide pilot program that could bring LearnLink services to rural districts that had struggled to provide adequate tutoring resources for their students. The potential contract was worth over $1 million and would serve more than 3,000 students across 15 counties. I stared at that email for a long time, thinking about the grocery store aisles I'd stocked just 6 months earlier, the office bathrooms I'd cleaned to pay rent, the nights I'd fallen asleep at my laptop while building what had seemed like an impossible dream. The girl who'd sat on those country club steps in the rain, incorporating a business on her phone, while her father's dismissive words echoed in her head, had created something that the state government now wanted to scale across an entire educational system. But this opportunity was also bigger than anything I'd attempted before, with complexity and responsibility that would require every skill I'd developed and probably several I hadn't learned yet. Success would mean proving that a small business built by someone with no traditional credentials could compete with established educational companies for major government contracts. Failure would mean letting down thousands of students who needed these services and possibly destroying the company I'd worked so hard to build. I called Alex and Rebecca into my office that afternoon and showed them the email. Their reactions were similar to my own excitement, mixed with terror, ambition balanced by the recognition of how much work lay ahead of us. We spent the rest of the day outlining what it would take to fulfill a contract of this magnitude, and the list was daunting. We'd need to hire at least 50 additional tutors, implement more sophisticated quality control systems, develop specialized training for rural education challenges, create reporting mechanisms that could satisfy state oversight requirements, and probably move to a larger office space that could accommodate the expanded team. But we'd also be helping students in communities that had never had access to quality tutoring services, providing opportunities for academic success that might otherwise be impossible due to geographic and economic constraints. The impact could be transformative, not just for individual students, but for entire communities where educational resources had always been limited. That night, I drove to the office and sat in the empty space, surrounded by the whiteboards and computers and coffee-stained desks that represented everything I'd built over the past months. The concrete floors and industrial lighting that had seemed so promising when I'd first rented the space now felt small and inadequate for what we were trying to accomplish. I thought about calling my father for advice about government contracting procedures, or asking Michael if he knew anyone in the state education department who could provide insights about the selection process. But instead, I opened my laptop and started researching on my own, reading procurement regulations and studying successful proposals from similar companies. I'd spent too many years waiting for other people to believe in my potential. I'd built LearnLink without their help, and I was going to scale it the same way, through research preparation, hard work, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from having been underestimated for so long that proving people wrong has become a reflex. The proposal deadline was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to convince the state of Oregon that a company run by a former grocery store clerk could deliver educational services for 3,000 students across 15 counties. 6 weeks to transform from a local success story into a statewide solution. I'd told my father I'd never need his approval to succeed, and now I had the chance to prove it on a scale that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. This wasn't about family dynamics anymore. This was about building something significant enough to stand on its own merits, something that would help thousands of students regardless of what anyone thought about the person who'd created it. The work ahead would be harder than anything I'd attempted before. But I'd already proven to myself that I could succeed when everyone expected me to fail. Now it was time to find out what I could accomplish when I expected myself to win. 6 weeks later, I stood in the Oregon State Capitol building, wearing a tailored navy suit I'd bought specifically for this presentation. The conference room was filled with education officials, budget analysts, and representatives from competing companies, all waiting to hear our proposal for the statewide tutoring initiative. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That nervous energy had transformed into something else entirely, absolute confidence in what we'd built. The presentation lasted 45 minutes. I walked them through our proven results, our scalability model, our quality assurance protocols, and our vision for connecting every student in Oregon with the educational support they deserved. When the questions came, I answered each one with data, examples, and the kind of detailed knowledge that only comes from actually running a successful operation rather than just theorizing about one. 3 days later, the call came. LearnLink had won the contract. Not just won it, but won it unanimously. The selection committee had been impressed not only by our proposal, but by our track record of actual results. While our competitors had submitted impressive documents and polished presentations, we'd submitted evidence of transformation in real students' lives. The contract signing ceremony was held 2 weeks later at the state education department. As I signed my name on the documents that would bring our services to 15 counties, I thought about the grocery store name tag I'd worn just 8 months earlier. The girl who'd stocked shelves for minimum wage was now the CEO of a company trusted by the state government to educate thousands of children. But the real moment of vindication came 3 months into the program, when the first quarterly results were published. Student achievement scores had improved by an average of 18% across participating districts. Rural schools that had struggled for years with limited resources were reporting their highest academic performance in decades. Teachers were telling us that their students were more engaged, more confident, more willing to ask questions and tackle challenging concepts. The local newspaper ran a feature story about LearnLink's impact, complete with interviews from families whose children had benefited from the program. The photo they used showed me standing in our new headquarters, a renovated downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows and modern workstations for our team of 85 employees. The headline read, "Local Entrepreneur Transforms Rural Education Across Oregon." My father saw the article before I did. He called me that morning, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. "Emma," he said, "I just read the newspaper piece about your company. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just for the business success, but for the difference you're making in these kids' lives." It was the conversation I'd dreamed of having for years, but when it finally happened, it felt different than I'd imagined. The validation was nice, but it wasn't necessary anymore. I'd already proven everything I needed to prove, not to him, but to myself, and to the thousands of students whose academic futures were brighter because of something I'd created. A month later, I received a call from the governor's office. They wanted to nominate LearnLink for the state's Small Business Excellence Award, recognizing companies that had made significant economic and social contributions to Oregon communities. The ceremony would be held at the state capitol, with media coverage and recognition from political leaders across the state. I thought about declining. Awards ceremonies felt like distractions from the real work of serving students and families. But Rebecca convinced me that the recognition could help us attract additional funding for expansion, and Alex pointed out that our success story might inspire other young entrepreneurs who were struggling to get their ideas taken seriously. The night of the ceremony, I sat at a table with my entire team, watching other business leaders receive recognition for their contributions to the state's economy. When they called my name as the winner of the Small Business Excellence Award, the applause seemed to echo through the cavernous hall. Walking to the podium, I looked out at an audience that included state legislators, business executives, and community leaders. But in the front row, I saw faces that mattered more than all the dignitaries combined. My parents were there, beaming with genuine pride. Michael sat beside them, holding his phone up to record my speech. Even some of my former tutoring students had come with their families, wearing their best clothes and grinning as their former tutor accepted an award for building something that had helped them succeed. My acceptance speech was brief. I talked about the students who had inspired LearnLink's creation, the tutors who made the platform work, and the communities that had embraced educational innovation. I mentioned the importance of supporting young entrepreneurs, especially those whose ideas might not fit traditional business models, but could still create significant value. But I also talked about failure, about being told you're not good enough, about the choice between accepting other people's limitations or proving them wrong through action rather than argument. I talked about the grocery store job that taught me work ethic, the office cleaning gig that showed me what I didn't want my life to become, and the family dinner that finally pushed me to bet everything on myself. Success isn't about having the right credentials or coming from the right background, I said, looking directly at my parents as I spoke. It's about identifying problems that matter and refusing to give up until you've solved them. It's about building something valuable and sharing it with people who need it. And sometimes, it's about proving to yourself that you're capable of more than anyone else believed possible. The standing ovation that followed felt surreal. These were people who would have dismissed me entirely a year ago, now applauding ideas I'd developed while living above a laundromat and coding until 3 in the morning. But the recognition wasn't what made the moment significant. What mattered was knowing that LearnLink had grown beyond my personal need to prove anything to anyone. After the ceremony, my father approached me as I was greeting well-wishers and accepting business cards from potential investors. He waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then asked if we could speak privately. We walked to a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the networking conversations and champagne toasts. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice serious. "I owe you an acknowledgement that I was completely wrong about your potential, but more than that, I owe you an admission that my skepticism was never really about your abilities. It was about my own fear of not understanding something that might be more important than the world I'd built my career in." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it led to others over the following months. He began asking me about technology trends, education policy, the challenges of scaling a service business. He introduced me to contacts who could help with legal and financial aspects of expansion. Most importantly, he started treating me as a peer rather than a child, whose choices needed to be corrected. But the relationship that changed most dramatically was with Michael. He'd been so inspired by LearnLink's success that he'd started his own side project, using his medical expertise to create educational content about health and wellness for teenagers. We began collaborating regularly, combining his clinical knowledge with my technology skills to develop programs that addressed both academic and health challenges facing young people. The business itself continued growing at a pace that sometimes felt overwhelming. We expanded to Washington State, then California, then began fielding inquiries from education departments across the country. Each new contract brought additional complexity, but also additional opportunities to help students who might otherwise struggle without adequate academic support. 2 years after that country club dinner, I was invited to speak at a national education conference in Chicago. The audience included university presidents, school superintendents, and education technology executives from across the country. My presentation focused on the democratization of educational resources, the potential for technology to bridge gaps between urban and rural learning opportunities. During the question and answer session, a superintendent from Texas asked how I'd gotten started in education technology without a background in either education or business. I thought about giving a polished answer about market research and strategic planning, but instead I told the truth. "I got started because my father told me I'd never be as successful as my brother," I said. "And instead of letting that define my limitations, I decided to define my own potential. I built LearnLink not because I had special qualifications, but because I could see a problem that needed solving and I was willing to work until I'd solved it." The room was quiet for a moment, then someone started clapping. The applause built until the entire audience was on their feet. Not because of my business success, but because of the reminder that significant achievements often come from unexpected places and people who refuse to accept other people's assessments of their worth. After my presentation, I was approached by a venture capital firm that specialized in education technology investments. They were interested in providing funding that could accelerate LearnLink's national expansion, potentially serving millions of students within 5 years. The numbers they discussed were staggering, valuations that would make LearnLink one of the most successful education companies in the country. But success had taught me something important about what actually mattered. The venture capital funding would mean faster growth, larger markets, higher revenues. It would also mean external pressure, investor expectations, and the kind of scaling challenges that could transform LearnLink from a mission-driven company into just another profitable business. Instead, I chose a different path. We continued growing organically, reinvesting profits into better technology, and expanded services rather than pursuing maximum valuation. We partnered with universities to research educational effectiveness, ensuring that our growth was driven by proven results rather than just market demand. Most importantly, we maintained the culture that had made LearnLink successful: genuine care for student outcomes, respect for tutor expertise, and the belief that educational opportunity should be determined by student potential rather than family income. 3 years after starting the company, I moved into a house in the same neighborhood where I'd grown up, just a few blocks from my parents' home. It wasn't about proximity to family, though our relationships had improved significantly. It was about completing a circle, returning to the place where I'd first been told I wasn't good enough, now as someone who had proven that assessment wrong in ways that no one could question or diminish. The house itself was modest compared to some of the options I could have afforded, but it had something I'd always wanted: a dedicated office space where I could continue building, creating, solving problems that mattered. The view from my desk looked out over the city where LearnLink now employed over 200 people, served 15,000 students, and generated annual revenue that exceeded what my father's law firm had taken decades to achieve. But the real measure of success wasn't financial. It was the thank you letters from parents whose children had gained confidence and academic skills they'd never thought possible. It was the messages from tutors who told us that working with LearnLink had restored their faith in education. It was the data showing that students in rural communities now had academic outcomes comparable to their urban counterparts. Last month, I received an invitation that represented the ultimate vindication. The university where I'd dropped out of law school wanted me to speak at their entrepreneurship program, sharing my story with students who were considering unconventional career paths. The irony wasn't lost on me. The institution that had once represented my failure now wanted me to inspire others who might be struggling with similar doubts about their potential. Standing in that lecture hall, looking out at young faces filled with ambition and uncertainty, I thought about the girl who'd sat in similar classrooms feeling like she didn't belong. I talked about the importance of trusting your own instincts, even when they conflict with other people's expectations. I talked about the value of work that feels meaningful, even when it doesn't look like traditional success. Most importantly, I talked about the difference between proving other people wrong and proving yourself right. Someone telling you that you'll never be successful isn't actually about you, I told those students. It's about their inability to see possibilities they don't understand. Your job isn't to convince them they're wrong. Your job is to build something so valuable that their opinion becomes irrelevant. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She explained that her family had been pressuring her to abandon her computer science major for something more practical. My story had given her the courage to pursue her own vision, regardless of their concerns. That conversation reminded me why LearnLink's success mattered beyond personal vindication or financial achievement. It had created a platform for other people to succeed, a proof of concept that unconventional paths could lead to significant contributions. Every student who improved their grades, every tutor who found meaningful work, every family who gained access to educational resources they couldn't have afforded otherwise, represented a small victory against the assumption that opportunity should be limited by circumstances. Today, when people ask me about the key to building a successful business, I don't talk about market analysis or funding strategies or competitive advantages. I talk about the night I sat on country club steps in the rain, listening to my father dismiss my potential, and making the decision to prove him wrong not through argument, but through action. The grocery store job taught me that honest work has dignity regardless of its social status. The office cleaning showed me what happens when you're invisible to people who consider themselves important. The tutoring reminded me that education can transform lives when it's accessible and effective. But the real education came from betting everything on myself when no one else was willing to make that bet. LearnLink succeeded not because I had special advantages or unique qualifications, but because I was willing to work harder than anyone expected, learn faster than anyone thought possible, and persist longer than anyone believed reasonable. The company became valuable because it solved real problems for real people, not because it impressed investors or satisfied family expectations. The girl who was told she'd never be as successful as her brother built something her brother couldn't have imagined. The daughter who was dismissed as a dreamer created opportunities for thousands of students to achieve their own dreams. The family disappointment became the family's success story, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to accept other people's limitations on who she could become. Sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's building something so significant that their opinion becomes meaningless, creating value that speaks for itself, and discovering that your own approval is the only validation you ever really needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.